Okay, folks, welcome back. This is our last, but certainly not least, session here with the biological control in greenhouses webinar brought to you by eGrow. Again, thank you to our sponsor, Syngenta, for generously sponsoring this. We really appreciate that. Our final presentation today is Matthew Kraus. He is from BioWorks, and he's going to be talking about a case study of using biological control for disease control in greenhouse crops. So with that, Matthew, let me give you control of everything here. You should have sound now.
Okay. Yeah, I see I'm turning green there. Good.
And I can hear you loud and clear. And I just gave you control of the webinar, so you should be able to share your screen.
Okay.
Fantastic.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Okay. Well, thanks again, Joyce and Brian, for inviting me to speak today. To get started, for some reason I'm not able to switch slides here. Don't know what's going on. Okay, here we go. Really, I'd like for you today to have some ideas on how to learn or how to develop your own disease management program with biopesticides for foliar disease management, for soil-borne or root disease management, but also in coming up with some tips on how to evaluate biopesticides in your own operation. So to go over a few little basics here, I think we've probably heard a lot of these already, so I won't dwell on them, but why do growers start and continue to use biopesticides? Well, for one, low restricted entry intervals and pre-harvest intervals, especially for those crops where there is residue issues or they are edible types of crops like greenhouse herbs. Many times growers start using them and continue to use them because they're safer for their workers, they're consumers in the environment. Many are also exempt from certain tolerances and maximum residue limits. And when it comes to other countries that they would be exporting, let's say, edible crops to. They reduce the development of resistance to synthetic pesticides. As Marjorie mentioned, that for some of the biocontrol agents that she had spoken of and some of the biocontrol products, that there are more modes of action involved there. So we know for those of no known resistance to them by the pathogens that we encounter. Many of them improve the efficacy of their chemical and biopesticide programs. We know that there isn't one single product out there that can do it all. And biopesticides offer very viable options for use in helping to fill gaps in disease control programs, either left by other biopesticides or even with the chemical pesticides that we have. And some can provide cost-effective disease control. And those tend to be the biopesticides that have some residual activity, especially those in the soil. And some of the products out on the market that are fungal, that are applied to soils, like Root Shield and Root Shield Plus, for instance, are those that can last several weeks in the soil between applications. And then finally, use of biopesticides can also improve plant, soil, and environmental health over time with continued use. And we've heard a few times earlier today by Ronald and some of the other folks speaking on the entomology side of things, that what you're using in the greenhouse can also impact over time some of the other biopesticide or biological control products that you're using there. So here's a way of managing residues, etc. What do? They suppress plant diseases and pests via one or more modes of action. They can act preventively rather than curatively, and I stress preventively. Marjorie alluded to this as well, that you really have to be thinking about them not curing disease and being able to penetrate the plant and knock disease out, but really using them to protect the plants against disease. They're effective at low to moderate disease pressure. So again, reiterating what Marjorie had mentioned before, that you don't want to be going into a losing situation where you already are inundated with a lot of disease or have some very risky situations there for controlling disease. And then they frequently provide other beneficial effects. What they don't do. This is a very, very important slide here, probably the most important in the early part of this presentation. They don't offer 100% protection. Of course, we don't know of any pesticide or fungicide that really does. They don't cure diseases, with few exceptions. There are some that can be applied to the foliage to help control powdery mildews, and I'm thinking of Millstop and Armicarb for that. But by and large, they don't cure disease. They don't work in environmental extremes. So if it's too high of a temperature or too cold, since many of them are microbial in nature or living in nature, they also have limits to how they can act or how they can grow in environmental extremes. As I mentioned before, they don't work at high disease pressure. They don't last indefinitely. Most have defined shelf lives and very defined storage conditions, especially if they're living products. And many of them may require frequent application, especially those products that are applied to the foliage. And finally, biopesticides, they're not silver bullets. They may feel great and so forth, but they can't make a bad grower good. So these are some typical effects that you can see when using the biopesticides that are on the market. In this case, this is hibiscus. The disease is Pythium root rot. The plant on the left was not treated with a chemical or a biological fungicide, whereas the one on the right was treated with a popular biofungicide that's drenched in the soil. So these are very real types of results that we can see. And these results can persist throughout the season, whether you have to do you're just doing a single application over a 10 or a 12-week period of time, or whether it's longer term and you're doing 2 or 3 applications during the season. It's still very real, but again, it's a protective effect and not a curative effect. Other examples of comparing with and without biopesticide treatment, but again, these are at growers' establishments, and these are very real phenomenon. So upper left-hand corner there, on the left, you'll see a plant, poinsettia plant that was started without a biopesticide drench, and the one on the right was, and that's about midway through the crop. Upper right-hand side, on the left-hand side, no drench treatment with a biopesticide, and on the right-hand side, a drench treatment for those seedlings. And you can even see some purpling taking place on those. I'll move on. Some strawberry transplants. On the left-hand side here, the transplants, the liners were planted with a biopesticide drenched into the soil, and on the right-hand side without. And that's simply just a rooting phenomenon. That is not so much from the disease standpoint. So some best use practices here. Well, think proactive or preventive. You've heard probably a lot about integrated plant health management or integrated disease or pest management. That's what I'm really talking about in this point here. You want to exclude the pathogen from your crop. When I say exclude, that means you want to have clean plant material. And I know Ronald Valentin had talked earlier about trying to actually have zero tolerance is not a real phenomenon. But when I say clean, I mean clean in quotes, clean. Really the cleanest material that you can get your hands on. And that's not always possible, and we'll talk about that in a moment. Good sanitation is incredibly important so that you're not spreading disease from plant to plant, so that you have a way of cleaning your irrigation water if you're recycling it. And of course, making sure that you are growing your plants in an environment that favors plant growth but doesn't favor disease development. And that's a very difficult thing to do because many of our pathogens grow well in the same environmental conditions that our plants grow well. You want to obtain accurate diagnosis of your problem, of the disease. That usually requires you to send samples of your affected plants to pest and diagnostic clinics in your state. I would consult with a plant pathologist first. What you may think is Pythium root rot may end up being Phalaenopsis or Rhizoctonia, so it's important to know that up front or at the end of one crop so that you know what you could be facing the next crop. So you could be making the right selection of a biopesticide or a chemical fungicide for that matter. Select the right product for the right disease. That goes hand in hand with the previous point. You want to make sure you're using the correct product so you're not wasting money. Follow label instructions. This is incredibly important. We generate these labels not just to satisfy EPA, but to also give you an idea of how these products should be handled and handled properly. We are very specific about how they should be applied. If you're going to be applying them differently than how you see them on the label, we can't stand behind the products in terms of their efficacy, and we're sure that you're probably not going to be satisfied with the results that you get. So please pay attention to what's on the label, what type of safety equipment you need to be wearing when you're applying them. Even though they tend to be safer products than some of the chemical products that are on the market, there are still cautions that are there. Some organisms, EPA is trying to make sure that people aren't sensitized to them and develop allergies, etc. Storage is incredibly important. You see on the package how you should store that product, that's how you should keep it so that it maintains its freshness for its shelf life. If you're going to take a biological product and put it into a 100-degree greenhouse for 3 or 4 days, you're probably not going to have as effective of a product after that period as if you would have kept it at 70 degrees or at refrigerated or according to how the product was labeled for storage. Also, you want to make sure that you're using the right formulation for the job. For sprays, drenches, dips, and sprenches, you have such terms as wettable powder, wettable dry granule, emulsifiable concentrates, emulsifiable suspensions. For granular materials, those tend to be solid, that you're not really mixing them with water, but you're incorporating them into soil. Some of the wettable powders can also be used as seed treatments. And then you want to make sure that when you're testing new products, you do it on a smaller scale before you really go all out. And I'll talk about this later on. Proper application is very important. You want to select the most appropriate application method. So along with that, you need to have the right equipment for that job. If it's spray equipment especially, you want to make sure that you're very well calibrated and that your equipment is maintained, nozzles are changed, etc., so that you're delivering the biopesticide to the right place on the plant. You want to also know when and how often to apply. Pay attention to shelf life and storage conditions. I bring that up again. Many biopesticides are living organisms. And then consider compatibility with other products and practices. Marjorie had spoken earlier about using cease and mill stop together, or there was a question in the audience about can I use this product with that product or multiple products, and we typically see that you have better results when you are using multiple products in a rotation and where possible in tank mixes to solve more than one problem at once. And of course, many growers are also looking at tank mixing to help save time and labor. But please refer to the manufacturer or the manufacturer's compatibility information to determine what is tank mix compatible versus what can be used in a rotation. And then where you see that there are incompatibilities, you need to look for alternatives to those products or time applications to overcome some of those compatibilities. A brief note here on using compatibility to your advantage. There are different types of compatibility. There is tank mix compatibility. That's where you can put the same types of, or you can put products in a tank together, mix them, and apply them as sprays, drenches, or even dips. And we see this a lot with not just fungicides and biofungicides, but we tend to see this also with insecticides and bioinsecticides. It's a very good way when they're compatible and when it's not going to injure the plant to kill several birds with one stone. There are cases where products aren't compatible in the tank mix, but one can be applied today and then tomorrow another can be applied, or 3 days later another can be applied. And that can be, you know, somewhere between a normal rotation or something as an intermediate application. And then finally, looking at rotating or alternating for those that you know, are incompatible unless you can treat them, you know, every 2 to 3 weeks in a rotation or alternation. Compatibility can also be useful for resistance management to keep your conventional chemistries effective, as well as with antibiotics and copper. Copper and antibiotics can tend to build up resistance very quickly when you're trying to control bacterial diseases. Also, for trying to reduce inputs into your program, especially chemical inputs, where you're trying to reduce chemical exposure to your staff or to yourself in your greenhouse. And then you can also use tank mixes and other types of compatible situations to help clean up or obtain quick knockdown of pathogens on plant material that you're bringing into the greenhouse, using the chemical to give you that cleanup or that quick knockdown, and then a biopesticide like a root shield or a soil guard to come in after that and give you longer term protection against the root diseases that you're trying to control. And then, of course, increased efficacy and cost efficiency of your labor can also be brought into the picture. Some general characteristics of foliar biopesticides. We know that they can act or respond immediately to many fungal and bacterial pathogens on the leaf surface. Good coverage and proper concentration are critical. In many cases, you need to get not just coverage of the top of the leaf, but on the undersides of the leaves, especially if you're protecting against bacterial diseases or against trying to protect plants that haven't been exposed to downy mildew, for instance, from inoculum that's coming from plants that already have that disease. So you can still protect the plant against a systemic disease, but only a plant that has not been infected yet. But again, you want to make sure that you're getting good coverage and you're using the right equipment for that. They require frequent application or rotation with other products during disease periods. A lot of this has to do with the fact that you have new growth that hasn't been treated yet, and since biopesticides typically are not systemic, you need to be treating that new plant material. They also lack nutrients for maintaining themselves on plant surfaces above the ground. And of course, the environment plays a huge role there. Temperature, moisture, etc., and UV can cause degradation of or loss of what you applied. And of course, many of these foliar biopesticides are compatible with chemical and other biopesticides. But again, check the labels, check with the manufacturers. So basic biological program, if you're just looking at something strictly biological, so when your plants have their first true leaves or at transplant, an initial spray either of that material or in a tank mix with another, followed by repeat applications, typically at 5 to 10 intervals, depending upon disease pressure. This is not a very inexpensive way of treating plants because they are not systemic, but in many cases, this is an approach that people are using if they're growing either edible crops like herbs or vegetables, or if they're trying to go more green, etc., and their markets are asking for it. General rotation program, where you're using a biopesticide in rotation, can also start at the first true leaf stage or at transplant with an initial biopesticide spray, followed by a rotation partner that you've identified, again at a 5 or a 10-day interval, followed by another biopesticide spray, followed by another rotation partner, followed by a biopesticide spray, and that repeating throughout the course of the crop. And then for some growers, they may also apply a biopesticide spray just before harvest. In many cases, you have a 0-day post-harvest interval on them. And that gives protection for the plants that are going out in the truck. They're going for the ride where it's dark and it can be moist, etc. And it allows that crop not to lose so much in the way of quality while it's being transported and before it arrives at the final destination. So this is an example of a grower that's using multiple products in a tank mix for control of foliar diseases, in this case on tomato and hydroponic greenhouses. They're using 2 products for foliar disease control and a 3rd product for control of lepidopteran insects in the foliage, and they do this weekly. And they're selling to big box stores, etc. You can see the results on the foliage and on the fruit of the plants, that they're not getting the diseases you would typically see in this setting for tomato, which can be powdery mildew, which can also be botrytis. So they're getting very good disease control and very good insect control. Likewise, a floriculture grower who's also using this in a polyhouse system with a wide variety of crops. Characteristics of soil and root biopesticides, they act quickly or after a lag period because sometimes they need to germinate and grow through the soil or around the root system before they're completely active, so they have to ramp up. They typically act via 2 or more modes of action. What's incredibly important here is good distribution and proper concentration. Again, these are typically not systemic. Bacterial products require nutrients and free moisture to move and grow and sometimes act. So they typically don't last as long in the soil in an active state. They may go dormant, but they may not be active. The fungal products are less dependent upon moisture to move, but still require nutrients for growth in the absence of the pathogen. So it's very important there to be mindful of that. And that's usually the reason why you need to be applying them at different intervals, because they may not hold up throughout the season. You have to kind of bring their numbers back up. So their activity may be then for 2 to 12 weeks, depending upon the active ingredient. And as I said before, reapplication may be needed to keep them at effective levels, because they're getting a lot of competition as well from naturally occurring microbes that don't do anything to control disease, but they're there kind of as impediments. And as with the fungal products, they're compatible with many chemical and biopesticides. So typical programs, quickly run through these. Whoops. Can start out as a, Start out at sticking or transplant, usually an initial drench, and then followed by repeat applications a few weeks later to 12 weeks later, depending upon the product. Consult the labels and consult with the companies on that. Or another program would be as a pre-plant incorporation of a granule, or as a container or tray bath with a drench material like a wettable powder or a wettable dry granule or a liquid flowable, etc. And then followed by repeated drench applications. And typically, growers will also follow or complete the crop with a biopesticide drench before harvest, so there's better storage or keeping quality on the truck to the garden center or actually in the garden center thereafter, something that a chemical fungicide can't always provide. And then some growers will also even do a transplant dip up front of what's coming in. It's an example of a grower that is just growing in oasis blocks seeding basil. Those trays are then dipped in a suspension of a biopesticide product called Root Shield Plus, and then 12 days later, you'll see on the right-hand side, this is what these crops look like. And this is basil, and it can have some issues with disease, especially if it's from an organic basil seed source, which this was. And the plants generally look like this. They will also treat when they transplant into their NFT system, their nutrient film technique system, for producing the finished crop. They'll apply that same product in there once, just at the time that they're transplanting, and that will last for the next 9 to 12 weeks. They're also using a combination program in here for foliar disease control with the cease and millstop, and they see less downy mildew when they're using that combination, which means that instead of having 30% of their plants affected, they end up with less than 5%. So they're not able to control it in the plants that are already infected, but they're able to control the spread of the disease throughout the rest of the crop. Other examples, I will move through these. This is an example of a celosia grower in Belgium that uses biopesticides in the soil and has for many years for controlling root diseases, and generally does not see root rot. Hanging baskets, very early on, getting drenched with a treatment, and then followed up by several weeks of growth later, also having very healthy plants with a drench treatment of a soil-borne biopesticide. There are cases where you might have you're unsure of the quality of the plant material coming in, or you know there's a history of it being infected with, let's say, Pythium. That's where you can do a chemical knockdown drench. It can be either used alone, or it can be tank mixed with a biofungicide that can kind of take over later on. In this case, you could also do the same thing, but you would want to make sure that the chemical you could do the same thing with a pre-plant incorporation treatment of a biopesticide, but then you need to definitely make sure that the chemical that you're using is compatible with that biopesticide. And then, of course, follow it up with repeated drench applications. And some will even do a quick knockdown treatment of the transplants when they come in to the greenhouse. This is an example of one such greenhouse that does that, another such greenhouse that does it, etc. Tips for developing your own program. As I mentioned before, think proactive or preventive. Properly identify the disease issues. Don't assume. Really consult a plant pathologist when it comes to disease. They can even mobilize the right horticulturist to tell you if you have nutrient deficiencies as well. It may not be a plant disease issue. Determine which products, practices, and timings you're currently using for these and their costs in use. So you may see that, oh my gosh, you know, that Root Shield or that Soil Guard is a pretty expensive material to buy. But if you look at actually the use pattern for that you're able to use it and get several weeks of protection out of it, as opposed to applying it every 2 or every 3 weeks, you may find out that you end up saving money and saving labor, as a matter of fact, even having a greater safety for your employees in the greenhouse and being able to work without having a long restricted entry interval. And be very wary of unregistered products, because these haven't been safety tested, as well as efficacy tested, etc. They tend to be lumped in and with some of our product lines, and it's kind of guilt by association. So be very, very wary of those. Always ask for data, and again, be careful. Identify the gaps in your current program. Are there efficacy gaps? Are there resistance issues that you contend with Pythium or with other pathogens? Are there compatibilities that you would like to have that you don't currently have? Is safety a factor? Is convenience a factor? Is your market asking for you to produce something that is a little more sustainable? And of course, what do the people that work for you say? Do they want to be working with safer materials? Do you want them to be exposed to harsher materials? And then, of course, having said all of that, how do you measure any of these types of gaps and being able to overcome them? Then you need to define what success looks like in your operation. What does it mean? So if I have equal control to with a biopesticide as a chemical pesticide in a program, is that good or bad? You know, many cases we have growers that start out and say, oh well, this is fantastic that it's working, but it's not doing anything more than the chemical. Okay, so if that is your judge, then make sure that you figure that out up front. Contact the manufacturer, other growers, and extension folks for advice. A lot of great application information is unfortunately not on the label, but if you contact us, you contact your extension folks and other growers that have experience and have success, we can provide you with some very good information that unfortunately can't be captured. Manufacturers tend to also have good advice online and good resources available there. So we have our own Ask the Experts team where you can either call in, email, or Skype us, or fill in this little form to ask questions and get advice. There's all sorts of information about compatibility and shelf life of the different products. We also include application-specific information for low-volume sprayers. Us and companies like Marone, for instance, with Regalia, also have tech sheets that can give you guidance on how to use our products in particular programs. Also, as Marjorie said before, test new products on a smaller scale before going all out. Set up a good comparison. You want to be able to see, is this having an effect or not? So leave some plants untreated or compare to your existing program with your test program. And then think about integrating these products in as opposed to all-out replacements. And then document your tests. Keep track of what, how, and when things occur, what you've done, how plants look, and what your customers think about it. Record what you and your staff see and experience, and then photos are so helpful because they allow you to capture the good, the ugly, and the surprises in your operation. And then, most importantly, keep an open mind. And that's all. Thank you very much, folks, for your attention, and we'll open it up to any questions if there's time.
Okay, thanks, Matthew. The first question is, would it make sense to use Root Shield plus Actinovate in combination as a soil drench?
They can be used in a program, no problem. Not a problem. And one will work, one product will cover a certain group of pathogens via different modes of action than the other. So it's not going to hurt anything. It can only help, especially where you have some very difficult disease prevention problems that you've encountered in the past. So yes, I would say that you could achieve some benefit from that.
Okay, before I ask the next question, I do want to just launch one last poll for everybody. If you just let me know if you would like to receive more information from Syngenta, we will pass that information along. Only that information for those of you who want the information, will we share that with Syngenta. We'll keep the rest of it private. While people are doing that, Matt, the question was asked, can you repeat what product was being used in the tomatoes to control lepidopteran pests?
In that case, it was Dipel.
Okay. And what about spraying nutritional or foliar sprays, fertilizer foliar sprays? Would they have an effect on the beneficial sprays that might be used?
It depends upon the type of fertilizer that's being used, and of course the microbe that would be used if it's um, uh, a bacterial product or not. So it's all a matter of compatibility.
Okay. Do most of these products that are used as foliar treatments include autofogger rates or suitability?
Yes. For our products, I'm not certain about that for other companies' products.
Okay.
It's a great question for Rick Yates.
All right. I don't see any other questions, but if you just hold on here for a second, Matthew, maybe another couple will come in. While I wait for the last couple of questions that might come in, again, I want to thank Syngenta for sponsoring this webinar on biological controls in greenhouses. Without their support, we could not make this happen. We hope to try to get you guys as much information out to you that we can, and Syngenta helps us do that. I want to thank Joyce Latimer for coordinating all of this, getting all the speakers lined up, and putting together this program. Like I said, I'm just running the webinar today. Joyce did all the heavy lifting with setting everything up. Please know that we are recording this, so if you missed something or know somebody who missed it and you'd like to review this, these webinars will be posted on our website, e-grow.org, under the webinar tab. So give me about 10 to 14 days before I can get those posted, but they will be there. It doesn't look like there's any other questions. So Matthew and all the other speakers, thank you very much for taking your time today. It's been a long day, but it seemed like people were really interested in the information that we all had to offer. So thank you.
Thank you, Brian.
Have a great weekend, folks. If you're like me, and you can head home and start shoveling snow again for the second time this week.